In this video, we're going to review sentence classification. And what that means is that sentences can be classified as either simple, compound, complex, or compound complex. And I think you'll see what that means as we go through these. But basically, we're trying to take these sentences apart and figure out how many clauses, independent or dependent, these sentences consist of. So let's start with our first one here. The white part of the yin-yang circle is the masculine side. And you can see that we have part, that's our simple subject. And in fact, all of this together here is our complete subject. So the white part of the yin-yang circle. And then we get to our verb in is. So if you wanted to break this up a little bit more, you could say that this is a prepositional phrase. It tells you a bit more about the part. And the word white is an adjective. Again, it just modifies this word part. So this is our subject then, and we have a verb over here, and it's a linking verb. So a linking verb is usually followed by what's called a subject complement, a noun or an adjective that describes the subject. So here we have a noun, side, and it just describes our subject over here. The part is the side. Now, all of this is just one clause because every clause has one subject and one verb. Well, you can have multiple verbs, but you usually just have one subject. And this one can stand by itself as a complete sentence. So we have one independent clause. When you have this pattern, when there's just one independent clause, we call this a simple sentence. So that's the first one. Our second sentence reads, after a breakfast of bacon and eggs, we went on a fox hunt that George had organized. So we have a couple of prepositional phrases that we start with, after breakfast and of bacon and eggs. And you can see here that after and of, these are the prepositions. And then these are followed by a couple of nouns here that are the objects of the prepositions. So prepositional phrases are not going to be part of the core of our sentence. But then we get to our independent clause here. We went on a fox hunt. And you can see we have a subject and a verb, we and went, and another prepositional phrase over here, on a fox hunt, which tells you a little bit about where we went. So this is our independent clause. And if you want, you can actually include all of these prepositional phrases in our independent clause. And then we have this little word that, which in this case is a relative pronoun, refers back to the fox hunt, and it introduces a relative clause. And a relative clause is just one type of dependent clause. So George here is the subject, and then we have had organized is the verb, or the verb phrase. This then is our dependent clause, okay? And when we have this pattern of one independent clause and at least one dependent clause, we call this a complex sentence. Our third sentence reads, his victory in the steeplechase surprised everyone. He hadn't trained at all. You can see here that this sentence is really two independent clauses, and these independent clauses are linked by the dash over here. Okay. Each one has its own subject, so his victory is the subject over here. And if you wanted to include this prepositional phrase, that would be fine. And then we have the verb, surprised, and a direct object in everyone. Second one, he is the subject, hadn't trained is the verb, and then there's a bunch of adverbial modifiers at the end here. All right, so we have two independent clauses joined here by a dash, and when we have two independent clauses in a sentence, we call this a compound sentence. So a compound sentence. All right, so let's move on to our next example. If you're not going to try your hardest, why should I? And when you start with this little word if, which is a subordinating conjunction, you right away get a clue that you're starting with a dependent clause. Because if you say if this, right, that's not complete, you need something afterwards that's going to complete it. So that's our independent clause. And now we have a subject over here in you in our dependent clause. Going is the verb, which is followed by an infinitive. Okay, so this all together, I guess you could say, is the verb phrase. And then after that, we have some other stuff over here. We won't go into too much detail. And then after that we have our comma, and often you have this pattern where you have a dependent clause, comma, independent clause, and then in our independent clause we have our verb in should, and I is the subject here. Okay, so I should, or why should I? All right, so this kind of pattern, we've seen this before. This is a complex sentence. And that brings us to the last couple here, and we'll first look at this one. Joshua was late to the concert because his motorbike had a flat tire, and it took him a while to change it. So first of all, if we look at the kind of major breaks in the sentence, we see that because is a subordinating conjunction, and is a coordinating conjunction, and that lets us figure out pretty quickly, if we just sort of scan the landscape here, to see that Joshua here, this is our first clause, right? Joshua, subject, was late, was is the verb, and so on. Little prepositional phrase here as well. And then our second clause here, his motorbike, there's another subject, had is the verb, and we have a nice direct object here. Oops. And then the last bit here, it's kind of hiding now, but that's our subject. Took is the verb, and him is the direct object, and then there's some other stuff after it as well. So if we tally this all up, then we can see that this first bit here is an independent clause. Joshua was late to the concert. You can say that by itself. Then we have a dependent clause because his motorbike had a flat tire, and we typically include the subordinating conjunction as part of the clause that follows. Okay, so that's our dependent clause. And then the last little bit, we ignore the coordinating conjunction in terms of figuring out if either clause on either side is dependent or independent. And so this whole last bit is independent. It took him a while to change it. So this pattern then, two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause, we call this a compound complex sentence. Pretty fancy term. One last one, and let's see if we can figure this one out to end with. So the last one here reads, she is going to Mongolia to participate in a horse race, so we thought we would help with the fundraising. And you can see that this whole first part here is an independent clause. It has a few phrases in it as well. So to Mongolia is a prepositional phrase. To participate is an infinitive. Starts a participial phrase. And then we have another prepositional phrase here as well. But the core of the sentence, or at least of this clause, is she is going. So she is the subject and is going is the verb phrase. Then we get to so, and that also is a coordinating conjunction, one of the fanboys. And then after that we have we thought. We is a subject and thought is a verb. So this is our second independent clause. This whole first part here is our first independent clause. And then after that, there's a little word implied here, and that word is that. So that is, in this case, a subordinating conjunction, and it ties the last clause to the previous one. Because otherwise we would have two independent clauses in a row here, right? This is an independent clause 2 otherwise. We would help with the fundraising, and you can't really have that. There has to be something that connects these two things, and that's that little word that. So we're just going to assume that this is here as well, and we're going to say that this is actually a dependent clause if we include that. So you'll see this quite often, that is missing and is implied. Definitely something to watch out for. If we do classify it this way, then we have two independent clauses and a dependent clause, and this one also is a compound complex sentence.